In this video, we are going to create fake API service. This will be generate API key and test fake user endpoint for prototyping. So anyway, user basically can generate the API key with or without name. So for example, we put John right here and then I click generated key. As you can see, we have this API key, right? And then basically user can try that API key in here, can click the get all user. As you can see, we get all the user in here. All right, this is basically 50 different user that generated. And also user can try to get single user. Here we go. All right, so this is the best URL right here. Localhost for now, just localhost 3000. Of course, you can just deploy the project on Vercel or whatever you want. And basically user have to send headers and the value is X API key and the value right here, all right, the API key. So anyway, let's try to open let me just open this Thunder client. As you can see here, I can go to the localhost 3000/API/test-API and I can go to users, right? And then in here, I can send the headers X API key. This is the API key that I'm going to send. So let's try to just copy this value and then just paste that right here. Here we go. So let's try to click send. As you can see, we have that response. If I do just random things in here that doesn't available, of course, this should be returning error. As you can see, invalid or inactive API key. That's super cool. So let's try to use the correct API key. Here, I'm going to paste that. And of course, I can just get 4 individual users. For example, I click go to user. And then the ID that I'm going to send is, let's try to say 45, for example. Let's try to click send. As you can see, we have this data right here. So anyway, everything in here just works. For example, the avatar in here, I'm using api.desibeer.com. If I copy that and then just paste that to the browser like this, if I hit enter, as you can see, we have that avatar. So anyway, that's what we are going to build. We're going to use Next.js, TypeScript, Tailwind CSS, Prisma, and then PostgreSQL for this project. So I hope you're excited and just let's get started. All right, so first what we have to do is let's generate brand new Next.js application. I'm going to call that fake API service. So let's hit enter. TypeScript, I'm going to say yes, ESLint, yes, Tailwind CSS, I'm going to use Tailwind CSS, source directory, I'm going to say no, App Router, yes, TurboPack, yes, import alias, no. This is done. So now let's just open the fake API servers folder on the VS Code. We can do code and then space dot to open VS Code. So the first thing what we are going to do is we are going to initialize the Prisma, right? So let's try to open terminal and we can do npx prisma init to initialize Prisma. This is will asking you to install Prisma before initialize. So I'm going to hit enter in this case. And also I'm going to open my blog right here. This is basically step by step how you can install Prisma in Next.js App Router. Great, after we initialize that right here, now we have the Prisma schema right here, okay? And then let's just try to create the schema, right? Because in here, I believe there's an example, but we're going to create our own schema in here. So first, I'm going to create a model called API key, all right? The API key right here, it should have an ID. So the ID should be a string, and then I'm going to put this as an ID that have a default value to CUID. Right, this basically will generate it automatically. And then next thing is I'm going to create the key. So key should be a string, and also this should be unique. And I'm going to say name. So user can basically generate key and also can put the name. So the name is basically just optional. So I can put string and then add question mark in here to make sure the name is just optional. And then also I'm going to create the is active. So is active is basically Boolean, true and false. So for the default, I'm going to setting that to true. And then created add, also update add, right? The created add is datetime, by default is now. And then update add is every time I update the API key, it should be update also the update add value. And then I'm going to change the name on the database, which is I'm going to change that into API underscore keys, right? So add map is basically just change the database name into API keys, just like that. Also, I'm going to create another model called request log. This is going to be have an ID. So I'm going to copy the ID come from the API key, and then I'm going to create the API key ID. This should be a string. And then the endpoint is going to be also string, and the method that user use, right? This is going to be string. It's like a post request, get request, and etc. And then the timestamp should be date time with the default value. I'm going to say now. And anyway, I also want to change the database name into the request underscore logs. So that's for the schema Prisma. So now let's try to running the npx. So let's take a look on the right here, right on the block. As you can see, we can just running npx Prisma generate. And then after that, we can run npx Prisma db push to push this schema on the database. But I believe that we don't yet update the right here, right, the database URL. So anyway, I'm going to use this my PostgreSQL local in my Mac right here. So I just want to click start, and then let's try to just copy this example here, right, database URL local. I'm going to copy that and then just paste that into this environment variable. As you can see in here, my username is basically Postgres. And also I'm going to change the name of the database here to like fake API service, just like this. So now let's try to run it. npx Prisma db push to push the schema into the database. Now, as you can see, it's done. Super cool. So we can run npx Prisma Studio to just check the database value on the Prisma Studio. As you can see here, we have API key and then request log, right? On the API key, we have the ID, key, name is active, create add, and update add, etc. So everything is fine right now. So the next thing what we are going to do is let's try to create the Prisma client, right? I believe right here. So we need to create the lib/db.ts. We don't yet have lib folder. So I'm going to just copy this command here and then try to paste. This is basically will create the lib folder and then create the db.ts file inside the lib folder. Here we go. Cool. So now just copy this Prisma client, right? Initialize right here. So the generated, it should be come from the, you can check on the schema Prisma right here. As you can see, it's on the app/generated/Prisma. So let's try to change this Prisma client into the app generated Prisma, just like this. Super cool. We're done. Let's take a look what the next thing we are going to do. I think we're done, right? So let's try to run npm run dev. Cool. So now we need to open the page.tsx app and then page.tsx right here. I just want to remove all this div, right? Just try to render div with class name. The minimal height, I'm going to say a screen, background gray 50, and padding white to 8. So anyway, inside in here, I'm going to render a div with the class maximal width. I'm going to use maybe 4XL, fine. And also I'm going to add the MX auto to make the maximal width for XL into the center. And also the padding horizontal, I'm going to set it to 4. Great. So inside in here, basically I'm going to render the title of the app and the description. Super simple. So that's why I just want to paste this right here. As you can see, this div right here, right, that have the text center, margin bottom 8, and then the heading 1, and then the paragraph right here. So let's take a look at the result on the browser. I think we don't yet running it. So let's just open localhost 3000. And then we should see this title and description right here, right? Free fake API service, generate API keys, and test fake user endpoint for prototyping. So now we need to create the generate API key section. After we put this title and description, I'm going to put this comment right here, right? Generate API key section. So in here, I'm going to say div. So this div is basically have class name. I'm going to set the background to white, padding 6, and rounded large, and shadow, and also the margin bottom to 6. And inside in here, I'm going to put the title. Now it's going to be inside the heading too. So I'm going to say generate API key. So let's try to save that and take a look. As you can see, we have this generate API key. That's super cool. Div that have class name, right? Display grid column 1 by default. And for medium and more, I'm going to set the grid column to 2, the gap is 4, and margin bottom to 4. And inside in here, let's put the input right here. So this input is have a type text, it's fine. And also I'm going to put the placeholder. So I'm going to say key name. So the name, as you can see on the Prisma schema, the name is just optional, right? So I'm going to put this as optional. So let's try to put optional. And also I'm going to put the value. So the value here, it should become from the state. And I'm going to give a name key name. For now, we don't have yet key name value, right? So we're going to create that on the top right here. I'm going to create state call key name like this. Of course, because we're using useState in here, this component, it should be a client component. So that's why in here, I'm going to say use client, just like this. And the key name value is basically string. I'm going to put string, and by default is just empty string. Cool. So let's go back to the input field. So now I'm going to add the onChange event. The onChange should be update the key name state. So that's why in here I'm running set key name into e.target.value. And then I'm going to add class name border, right? Rounded and bx and then by in here. So let's take a look at the result. All right, so this is the input field. As you can see, it's super simple. So now let's go back to the VS Code. Under the input tag right here, I'm going to put a button. So this button should be have class name, call this background blue 500. The text is white, the px4, padding y to 2, and then rounded. If I hover that, the background will be changed to blue, and this will be this if the button disabled, the opacity is 50, right? For the text in here, I'm going to call that generate key like this. So let's try to save that. Let's take a look at the result. Here we go, right? We have the background blue right here. I also want to add another props on this button. So let's go back on this button and put this on click and disable, right? If I click this generate key button, it should be running the generate key function. And this button should be disabled if the isLoading is true. So let's first create the isLoading state on the top right here. So I'm going to call that state and then is loading like this. So this is going to be in Boolean. By default, of course, it's going to be in false, just like this. And then now we have to create the generate key function. So let's do const generate key set equals to an arrow function. For now, I just want to put that empty string like this. I also want to change the text on the button. It should be based on isLoading. As you can see, if the isLoading true, it will show generating with 3 dots in here. Else it's just generate key text right here. So let's take a look. Here we go. If I, for example, change the isLoading to true, and I hope we have generating right here, right? That's what I want. Super cool. So now let's try to render the API key. So let's create the UI first. So after we render the button in here, I'm going to also render the generated key. As you can see in here, this is basically super simple. If the generated key have a value, I'm going to render this div that have background green 5D, padding 3, rounded, and border. And also this is the p tag that say your API key. This is unlimited request. And then I'm going to put the generated key inside a code tag right here. So let's try to create the generated key state on the top. So I'm going to paste this state right here. As you can see, generated key. So let's try to put just a random key in here maybe, right? I just want to put a random value and just try to see the value right here. As you can see, this is the result. After I restart my VS Code, finally the styling is just applied right here. So the next thing what we have to do is we are going to create API. So when I click the generated key right here, it should be make a post request on the API route. So let's go back to code in here, and I'm going to create API folder, right? And then inside that, I'm going to create another folder called generate key like this. And we have to create route.ts file just like this. So now in here, I'm going to export async function called post. And then here we can just grab the request, right? The request, it should be have type next request like this. And then what we have to do in here is I'm going to use try and catch. So just for example, I'm going to return next response like this dot JSON, right? I'm going to send the JSON in here called success into true. This is just for example. So let's try, go back to the page.tsx in here, and basically we are going to handle the generate key function. So just make sure this should be async function. And then what we have to do inside this function is we are going to make a post request on this route. So let's try it. So before we make a fetch in here, the first thing is I'm going to set the loading to true, right? And then here I'm going to say try and catch. Let's say try and then catch down here. And then inside this try, what I have to do is I'm going to say const response that equals to await for fetch, right? And we're going to make a fetch on the /API/generate key, right? Just make sure the name is same with this folder, generate key. And then here, I'm going to send some data. So the method, it should be post request. And then for now, it's fine just like this. So let's just click that. I hope we have some response on the network, right? So let's go to network, and then if I click generate key, as you can see here, we have the generate key, and this is basically make a post request, right? It's make a post request on the API right here, and then the response should be success true. That's why in here we're setting that to success true, right? So this is works pretty cool. So now let's try to send some headers. The headers that we are going to send in here is basically content type application JSON. And also we are going to send the body. So the body, for this case, I'm going to say JSON.stringify, and then I'm going to send the name, right? The name is basically come from the key name state right here. It's basically everything we're typing on this input field, right? Cool. And then if I not give any value on this input because name is optional, I want to send maybe undefined. So let's do or undefined. And finally down here, I'm going to create variable called results that equals to await for the response.json. All right, after we fetch that, I await for the response.json. And then I just want to console log the result so we can see the value on the console, just like this. So now let's go back to the route in here, and then basically I'm going to make sure that we have correct type of this response. So that's why I'm going to create another folder called types, and then inside that I'm going to create api.ts file. And in here basically I'm going to create the interface of the API key response. So here, as you can see, I create export interface API key response. The API key response, it should be have response type success boolean, and then we have data. The data is optional in this case, and inside the data we have the API key. It's a string created at string, and if error happen, error should be also string, right? So now we can use the API key response on the route right here. So let's just put it like that, and then we can just import that right here. Okay, cool. So if you take a look on the page.tsx, basically we send the body, all right, on this fetch, and then the value is basically name. So let's go back on the route. So in here, basically we need to get the name value. So first we are going to use this body right here, right? Const body set equals to wait for request.json. And then we can just grab the name from this body basically. So we can say const and then name from the body like that. So here we are going to generate a unique API key. So I'm going to make a comment here, generate a unique API key. So first I'm going to create variable with let because we are going to change that value. So that's why I just want to use let in here. The first thing is called API key. This is string, and key access is by default true. And down here, I'm going to run do and then while. So this is just like the name. This is will do the things that inside this right here while the key access true, right? Just like that. So what we have to do inside this do is basically first I'm going to change the API key into the generate API key function. So we don't yet have this function, right? So let's create that function on the lib right here. I'm going to create a folder called utils.ts. Here we go. So basically to generate the random API key, we have to use UUID in this case. So I'm going to install that npm install UUID, right? Just install that package. And then we have to import that. So here I'm going to import version 4 as a UUID version 4 from the UUID. And then what I have to do in here is just try to export the function. I'm going to call that generate API key, right? And this function, it should be return string, just like this. So what I want to return in here is basically I'm going to make a fk underscore, and I'm going to put the random UUID 4 right here. And then I'm going to replace all the space basically. So here we go, right? Just super simple function. So now we can use that function right here. Here we go. Cool. I'm going to check the API key is available on the database or not. So in here, as you can see, I'm running existing set equals to await for the Prisma, right? .api key .find unique. So this basically will looking for key value on the API key model, API key database. And then if we have that value, the existing should have value, right? And then here, I'm going to make sure the key access, I'm going to setting that into the existing. So after we generate a random API key, what we have to do with that API key? So basically, we have to put that API key on the database. So here I'm going to put this create the API key, right? So this is basically will await for the Prisma.api key model and create this data here, right? The key should become from the API key, this random value in here, and the name is basically come from the name of this body right here, right? And if there's an undefined, just put null. So now let's put the new API key value on the response in here. So I'm going to put the data. The data it should be on object, and then this object should be have the API key, new API key dot key, right? To access the key right here. And created add is basically new API key dot created add to ISO string like that. And also, if something wrong happen, I'm going to paste this catch right here, right? Catch, grab the error, and then it is basically just console error, and then just return next response, success to false, and then the error is failed to generate API key, and then the status is 500. Just super simple. So let's try to go back to page.tsx, right? So in here, we just console log that, and then let's try here. I'm going to just generate key. And as you can see, we have this success to true, right? With the API key value and then created that value. It's super cool, but I like to, this value is rendered on the browser. So let's try to go back in here, and basically what I'm gonna do, let's try to set this generated key into that value key from the API, right? So let's try to do that in here. So first I'm gonna check if the result is success. As you can see, if the result is success is true, I'm going to set the generated key into the result.data.api key, and then else just alert result.error. So now let's just try that again. I'm going to generate it. As you can see, we have this value. That's what I want. And on the catch, if something wrong happened, I just want to alert that failed to generate API key and then set the loading back to false. Right, so now we have to create another API route to basically testing out the fake API service. So here I'm going to create another folder inside the API folder. I'm going to call that maybe test API, right, slash the endpoint. So I'm going to do 3 dot and then endpoint, right? The endpoint should be like users or posts or anything like that. So here I'm going to create a road.ts file. So in here, I'm going to create async function called handle request. And then this function, it should be have try and catch, try and then catch. And down here, I'm going to basically export this function as a post, as a get, because when user make a get request or post request or put request or delete or whatever, it just return like a get request. So let me just try to do that down here. So this is basically what I mean, right? If user make a get request, it just basically do the same function. If user make a post request, it's basically make a response this one right here and etc, right? The response is just same with all requests. So first we need to grab the request. So in here I can do request. The type is next request like this. And then inside the try, what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to get the value from the headers. And then from the headers, I'm going to get the X API key. So let's just try to, I think just try to return that. Or I just want to copy from the route in here to just make it simple. I'm going to copy and paste that. And then the next response, JSON here, I'm going to remove the type. And then let's say key set equals to API key, right? Just remove the data. So now if user make a get or post or put or whatever, it just return this right here, right? The key. So let's try. Basically, I have the right Thunder client extension that installed on my VS Code. So on the Thunder client, I'm going to make a request in here. So this is basically really similar like Postman, but this is basically on your VS Code. So that's why I love that. Here, let's try to just copy the URL and then just paste that right here. The URL should be http localhost 3000 / API / test-API, and then the endpoint, I'm going to say users in this case. Right, so let's try to make a get request. I'm gonna send. As you can see, of course, it's not show anything, right? The key is null. So let's try to send the headers. As you can see on the endpoint here, we have to send this request.headers.get. So that's why in here we can send X API key. So let's try X API key set equals to 1, 2, 3, for example. Let's send that. And as you can see, we have this value back, key 1, 2, 3. Right, cool. So now let's add condition if user not send the X API key. So here I'm going to say if the API key doesn't exist, right, it just return the next response.json, and then the success is false, the error is API key is required. So let me just remove the type right here for now, like that. So let's try to make a request again without the X API key. Click send. As you can see, we have this success to false, API key is required, right? Cool, it's working. And yep, now we have to create the type. So let's go back to the types and then api.ts right here. So this is basically the type that I'm going to use. First, as you can see on this user, right, we have the interface user that have an ID, name, email, etc. We have website, avatar, and etc. And also this is the API response. This is basically what we are going to use on the endpoint right here on the handle request on the test API, right? And here we have the success boolean, data is optional and the error is also optional. And then we also have the user response. This is for all the user. As you can see, we have user in array. This is for the individual user. So basically it can make a request for individual user to get the one user, right? So let's just close that and then go back to the route in here. And then now we can put the type in this JSON right here. Just make sure we import that. Here we go. Cool. So now we need to handle the different endpoint. So I just want to remove this return, right? And then I'm going to make this comment right here, handle different endpoint, only user now. So basically you can create any endpoint you want, like a post, like a comments, like everything you want. But in this example, I just want to use users, right? So I'm going to use switch in here, and then I'm going to grab the endpoint. So let's do endpoint in here. So this endpoint, it should become from the param. So let's try to put a variable called endpoint, params.endpoint.join/. So this param, it should become from the parameter of the handle request function. So let's try to grab that. After we get the request in here, we can add a comma, And then down here, we can just put the params. So the param should be have type string inside an array, right? Params.endpoint and then string inside an array. So here, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to check if the case is, for example, users. So basically I can say like return next response.json. And then for example, I'm going to put this object right here. Let's say data. And then I'm going to put this object right here, users. Right, this is just for example. So let's go back to the Thunder client and let's try to make a send in here. API key is required, so we have to send the API key. Here we go, we have data users, right? Because now we on the user/user right here. If I do something like post, maybe we don't have yet, right? So if I send, of course, it's just return 500 internal server error. All right, you get the idea. So what we have to return in here is not just user, because in here we are going to return the fake users. As you can see, this is what we have to do. So we are going to create a variable called all users set equals to fake user function and return new response.json. The type is user response, right? It's come from the type that we already create. The success is true. The data is all users. So we need to create the fake user right now. So let's go back to the, I believe on the utils right here, we need to create that function. So anyway, I just want to paste this fake function right here, fake data generator for users, right? That have type user right here, come from the type. And then as you can see, it's basically create a 5D data, right? And just put that inside array.form length 5D. So that's why we have 5D users. And in here, I just create a mapping array. As you can see, ID is I plus 1. So it should be increment by 1, right? The ID should be 1, 2, 3, and etc. until 5D. And then also we have the name, email, username, and etc. So this is just random fake data generator. Cool, so we have that. Now let's try to import that in here. Here we go. Let's try to make a request right now. As you can see, if I click send, just make sure we on the users, right? Users, click send. Here we go. We have that data, right? That's super cool. And now there is no validation for the API key, right? Because any API key can make a request right now. So we have to basically validate that API key. It should be on the database. So now we have to validate that API key. So here I'm going to create a variable called validation. Set equals to wait for validate API key. We put the API key, endpoint, and then the request. So we have to create the validate API key. I'm going to create this function on the top right here. This is basically just super simple function. As you can see, I just paste that, and then let's try to just explain this. So let's take a look what happened on the validate API key function. As you can see, this function is like a API key parameter, endpoint, and the request, right? And the first thing is this basically will find the API key on the database. It just wait for the Prisma.API key table and find unique where the key is equal to API key from the parameters. And in here, it is basically just checking if the key record doesn't exist or the key API key right here doesn't have on the database. It's basically just return valid to false and the error is invalid or inactive API key. Okay, and then down here is basically put that log on the request log table on the database. As you can see in here, it's basically wait for the prisma.requestlog.create. Create is basically adding new data on the database, right? And send this data, API key ID. As you can see, we get this error. I'm not sure why. So let's take a look the schema right here. Basically, as you can see, we're using AOI. So this is wrong. So we have to use API key ID, right? So now let's go back in here. This is still error because we don't yet running the npx prisma db push. Just like this will be push the new data. So let's just take a look. Hopefully the error now is gone. As you can see, it's super cool. So we can running npm run dev again and just close the terminal. Right after we adding the request log data, finally return valid to true. Just that's it, super simple. So let's go back to the handle request. As you can see, if this validation is basically return valid, false, and true, right? So what I'm going to do in here is check if the validation.valid is false. I'm going to return this next response.json. The success is false. The error is validation.error, right? Just that's it. If the validation.valid is true, this basically will running this handle different endpoint right here. So now let's take a look on the Thunder client, and we are going to basically make a request. As you can see, if I click send, we should get an error. Is because this is just X API key that doesn't available on the database. As you can see, we have invalid or inactive API key. So if I open localhost 555 right here and go to API key, this API key right here, maybe, right? I'm gonna copy that and then just put that on the X API key headers. So now if I send, we should get the data, right? That's pretty cool. So let's try to go back to the page, the road right here. And then if we make a request on the individual user, so let's try to add another case in here. So after the case user, I'm going to paste this case user for individual user. As you can see, what happened in here is this is single user with query param support. So the URL should become from the request.url, and then we basically get the url.searchparam.getID, or if the ID doesn't exist, it just get one value in here on the user ID. And then this is the users, all right? It's basically all the fake user that we already create. And then finally, just find where the user ID, right, come from this search params is equal to UID come from the fake users. It will just basically return that down here, right? And the user response should become from the type. Here we go. And then finally down here, we have to put the default case. So the default case, I'm going to say return next response.json API response. And then as you can see, the success is false. So let's just try that. Here, I'm going to go back to Thunder client. So now on the Thunder client, let's try to get the individual user. So here I'm going to say /user for individual user. And then I'm going to say ID into, for example, 1, right? So now if I click send, as you can see, we have this user 1 with ID 1, right? If I do 12, for example, let's send, if I have in here, we have the user 12. So now I'm going to add new feature that user can try the API key on this page. So after the generate API key section, I'm going to put this API key input. As you can see, we have this div, right? I'm going to make it bigger. This input right here, it should have value API key and then set API key for the state. So let's try to scroll up and we are going to create the state on the top right here, right? API key. And then set API key, it should be running after we get the API key, so which is right here. So I'm going to run the set API key right here. After the result.success true, we have the key, right? So this is just running in here. So now as you can see, if I generated key, now the API key should be automatically putting on this input field right here. So next, I'm going to add a button right here to test all the user and the individual user. So let's try to go back on the code, and then I just want to paste the UI basically. So after this API key input, I'm gonna put another div right here, right? Test endpoint. As you can see, this is basically have two button, get all user and get single user. So let's try to just create the test API function on the top right here so we don't have any error. So I'm gonna say const test API set equals to error function, just like this for now. So let's try to save that. Let's take a look on the browser. As you can see, we have these two buttons, right? Get all user and get single user. So let's try to working with the test API function. So let's try to make it bigger so you can see clearly. Here, I'm going to change the function to async function, and then this function is like a parameter endpoint. So let's do endpoint. This should be a string, because as you can see on the bottom right here, this is a test API that sends users endpoint. This is like a user parameter ID set equals to 1 endpoint. That's why in here we grab the endpoint. what we are going to do first is basically, I'm going to check if we don't have API key, just return nothing. And then finally, we're running try and catch right here, try and then catch. Like we're doing on the Thunder client, in here I'm going to make a GET request on the API/test-API and then the endpoint, right? And we send the headers. The headers that I'm going to send is X API key into the API key. And then finally in here, we get the result from the response.json. And then we put the value, the result right here into the set test response. So we have to create that state on the top. So I'm going to paste that right here. As you can see, test response, set test response. Here we go. And if something wrong happened, I just want to say set test response into fail to test API. Just that's it. So now we have to render the test response state value. So I'm going to do that under the test endpoint right here. So in here, I'm going to render that. As you can see, first I check if the test response have a value and then render that inside the pre tag right here. As you can see in here, basically we're using JSON.stringify and then result null2 right here just to make a beautiful looking object on the UI here. So let's try here. I'm going to generate the key. As you can see, if I click get all user, now as you can see here, we have that beautiful response right here. I can scroll down like this. So if I click the get single user, we have the user one basically. And everything you see in here just works. For example, the avatar, I'm going to copy that, right? And I'm going to paste that on the browser. It should be basically render this avatar right here, right? If I change that to maybe 12, and here we go, right? We get that face. That's super cool. So anyway, I think we're done with this project, but I like to just add some like documentation right here after we put that. Let me see right here, test response. Under in here, I'm going to put the API documentation. So I'm going to put the code on description. So just don't worry about that. As you can see in here, we have the heading too. We have the base URL. So anyway, we have to create the next public base URL on the environment variable. So let's go back in here. And then I'm going to put the next public base URL set equals to, in this case, I'm going to say localhost 3000, just like this. So now let's take a look on the browser. Here, as you can see, we have this API documentation, super nice. We have the base URL right here, the headers that it's have to send, right? And then we have the available endpoint. This is /user to get all 50 fake user. And then we have /user and then ID1 to get single user. That's pretty cool. So let's try that again. I'm going to zoom out. So let's do generated key and then get all user. All of this is just works. That's super cool. So I hope this is useful, guys. Thank you so much for watching and then see you on the next video. Bye-bye.